welcome to the Schools Revenue Funding 2022 to 2023 Operational Guide Workshop. Just to introduce myself, so I'm Neil Smith, so I work on the Pre-16 Funding Policy Implementation Unit within the Education Skills Funding Agency. The Ops Guide is here to help local authorities and school forums to plan and implement the funding for the 2022 to 2023 financial year. There have been limited changes made this year to ensure stability at a time when COVID-19 is already placing additional pressures on the system. But at the same time, this allows us to continue to move towards a future direct NFF, formerly known as the hard NFF. The NFF provisional allocations were published on the 19th of July. So changes to funding in 22-23. There's been an increase in £10,000 to the maximum sparsity values. We've also increased the basic entitlement and various other factors, as you can see there, such as the DACI, the FSM EVER6, low prior attainment and EAL and lump sum by a minimum of 3%. And there's 2% increase to the funding floor and the minimum per pupil levels and the free school meals. All sparsity distance are now based on the road distances instead of the straight line distances as previously used, or crow flies. And there's also been a change where we've allowed a sparsity distance taper to be introduced in addition to the existing year group size taper. So that what this does is it allows you to set within a 20% threshold of that distance taper to capture more schools within that. So data for FSM6 is now taken from the most recent October school census instead of the preceding January census. This helps to reduce the lag by approximately 9 months and is consistent with arrangements for other NFF factors as well as the pupil premium. There's also a change with the data from the 2019 Early Years Foundation Stage Profile and Key Stage 2 tests as used as a proxy for the 2020 tests following the cancellation of assessment due to COVID. Mobility. Pupils who joined a school between January 2020 and May 20 attract funding for mobility based on their entry date, rather than by virtue of the May school census, being the first census at the current school, as the May census did not take place due to coronavirus. The business rates is also changing, and that will be paid by the ESFA direct to billing authorities on behalf of all state-funded schools from 2022 to 2023. Further to the consultation on changes to the payment process of schools' business rates. Schools' business rates will be paid by ESFA, as I've said, from 22-23. Further details are available separately on this through the formal consultation response published this summer. So key features for 22-23, the MFG, as with last year, will remain at between 0.5 and 2%. Teachers' pay and pensions grants are now fully rolled into the NFF, so no separate adjustments are needed in the local formula beyond what was already done in 21 to 22 to account for these grants in the 22-23 year. MPPLs remain mandatory at the new NFF values and continue to be a key ministerial priority. Local authorities continue to be able to transfer 0.5% from the schools block to other blocks, such as the high needs, with the schools forum approval. It is worth noting that any transfer will automatically include the additional funding for teachers' pay and pensions from last year, which is now being rolled into the baseline. Any transfers above 0.5% or for any other amount without schools forum approval will require a disapplication. The department will continue to approach selected local authorities about their deficit plans to begin or continue discussions with them. There's increased funding for the high needs block. However, some local authorities have been unable to pay off their historic deficit from the DSG over the next few years. In these cases, we will work together with you, as already outlined. There's been some changes to the LAM grant, so the School Improvement and Monitoring Brokering Grant. There's revised conditions to enable it to be used to support education recovery initiatives. The early years operational guide is due to be published in the autumn. We haven't got a fixed date for that at the moment, but I know that's being worked on in the background. Local authorities should follow this guidance when funding providers to deliver the early years entitlements in 2022 to 2023. The APT will be provided initially including the October 2020 census information. This will allow local authorities to model the impact of changes to their local formula and undertake any necessary consultation. The APT tool will be updated just before the final December NFF announcement to include the October 21 census information, ready for your final APT. The DfE have published the high needs funding arrangements in August 2021. This is published approximately a month or 2 months before they would normally publish it, confirmed following aspects of the high needs NFF. There's been another significant increase nationally, 780 million, or 9.6% compared to the amounts allocated in 21 to 22. And the funding floor for high needs will continue at 8% per head of 2 to 18 population. The hospital education factor amount will be uplifted in line with the 8% funding floor factor, and there will be a limit on gains set at 11%. Indicative dedicated schools grant budgets were published in July. There's a link there with further information. And these are subject to change and will be confirmed in December. Why do we produce indicative DSG budgets? Well, it means that local authorities can build their formula using these indicative budgets. This allows more time to plan ahead of setting local formula for 22-23. Why December for confirmation? We use the census data from October 2020 for the indicative NFF calculations, and then this is updated for the 21 October census once available. However, this won't be available to us until the end of October. We then have to process that information, and we'll use that to update the calculations ahead of the December final budgets being announced. Lead factors. This covers things such as basic entitlement, minimum per pupil levels, deprivation. These are compulsory. It also covers other optional factors such as prior attainment, looked after children, English as an additional language, mobility. It's worth noting that local authorities must allocate a minimum of 80% of their delegated schools block funding through the pupil-led factors. So basic entitlement based on pupils as per the October census. Funding is allocated according to a basic per pupil rate, and there is a single rate for primary, but there can be different rates for Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. The minimum amount for primary is set at 2,000, with a minimum of 3,000 for Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. In the NFF, we've used £3,217 for primary, £4,536 for Key Stage 3 and £5,112 for Key Stage 4. Local authorities with the largest age-weighted pupil units tend to be London-based. Authorities can choose to increase the pupil number count for schools with higher reception pupil numbers in the January census rather than the October census. We do not include reception uplift in the national funding formula. For local authorities currently use no reception uplift, should consider whether to do so in 22-23. As we move towards direct NFF, consideration is needed to align and minimise the impact of the direct NFF when it comes in. Minimum per pupil levels, as I stated earlier, is still a key ministerial priority. The purpose of this factor is to allow local authorities to provide amounts up to the minimum per pupil levels for primary and secondary schools. As you can see, the rates are on this slide. All local authorities must implement the MPPLs to every school using the same methodology used in the NFF. Further details are provided on this within the NFF technical note. Specific MPPLs will be produced that differ from these schools with non-standard year groups such as middle and all through schools. Any capping and scaling cannot take the per pupil funding below the MPPL. So MPPLs continue to be a ministerial priority, and any variance to the levels, and in particular to reduce the levels of the MPPLs, will need to be exceptional and on the grounds of affordability only. We have had some requests to disapply the standard calculation where a school's MPPL value is significantly skewed by the unusual year group sizes. For example, where a local authority want to provide a higher MPPL for an all-through where the secondary cohort is significantly larger than the primary. Local authorities who wish to reflect the NFF calculation by excluding the premises factors that have been excluded from the NFF calculation can do so through the APT and will not need to submit a disapplication. The funding floor will be set at 2% for 22-23, in line with the forecast GDP deflator, to protect the pupil-led per pupil funding in real terms. So additional needs. So this covers deprivation, prior attainment, looked after children, English and additional language, and mobility. The deprivation, this is a compulsory factor. Local authorities using FSM to calculate deprivation can choose to use either current FSM, Ever 6 FSM, or both. We measure eligibility for current FSM using the previous October census, and Ever 6 FSM has changed to use the previous October census as well, rather than the January census. Ever 6 is the pupils entitled to free school meals at any time within the last 6 years. The Adaki measure uses 6 bands, and different values can be attached to each band. Different unit values can be used for primary and secondary within each band. MHCLG published new Adaki data on the 26th of September 2019, changing the banding system to bands A to F, where A is the most deprived. The schools not open in October 2020, which are included in the 21-22 APT, the FSM 6 data is used for the 2022 to 2023 NFF. We will automatically set the FSM Ever 6 ratio to be equal to the current FSM ratio for schools where the FSM Ever 6 rate is recorded as lower than the current FSM rate. Prior attainment is another optional factor. All local authorities used this factor last year, apart from one. Prior attainment factor acts as a proxy indicator for low-level, high-incidence special education needs. Local authorities can apply this factor for pupils, primary pupils, identified as not achieving the expected level of development in the early years foundation stage profile, and for secondary pupils not reaching the expected standard in Key Stage 2 at either reading, writing, or maths. More challenging Key Stage 2 tests were introduced in the 15-16 academic year, and as such we have weighted the low prior attainment factor for some secondary year groups so that those who have sat the more challenging Key Stage 2 tests do not have a disproportionate influence within the total for the prior attainment factor in the mainstream formula. Following the cancellation or incompleteness of assessments in the summer of 2020 and 2021 due to COVID, the same national weighting will be used for pupils in Year 7 and 8 as those in Year 9, set at 65%. The number of pupils identified as having low prior attainment in the data will be multiplied by the relevant weighting to determine the number of pupils eligible for the factor for funding purposes. Local authorities will not be able to change their weighting, but will be able to adjust the secondary unit value, as in previous years, to enable local authorities to maintain the factor at previous levels without significant turbulence. Further details about this are available in the operational guide. Looked after children is another optional factor. However, only 9 local authorities use this factor in 21-22. This factor is available for local authorities to use. However, it is not used as part of the NFF. We map this data to schools using the January school census to identify the number of looked after children in each school or academy. We do not use a looked after child factor in the national funding formula. Instead, we increased the pupil premium plus rate from 2019 to 2020 from 1,900 to 2,300. Local authorities should consider this, the fact that we don't use this in the NFF, when considering whether to use this in 22 to 23. English as an additional language. This was used by all bar 2 local authorities last year. This is again an optional factor. Pupils identified in the October census with a first language other than English may attract funding for up to 3 years after they enter the statutory school system. Local authorities can choose to use the indicators based on 1, 2, or 3 years. There can be separate unit values for primary and secondary. We've used 3 years in the national funding formula. Local authorities should consider this when setting their local formula. Mobility is another optional factor. Mobility factor allocates funding to schools with a high proportion of pupils who first joined on a non-standard date in the last 3 years. From 2020 to 2021, a new methodology is applied to allocate this funding on a formulaic basis. To be eligible for mobility funding, the proportion of mobile pupils a school has must be above the threshold of 6%. Funding is then allocated on a per pupil amount to all mobile pupils above that threshold. A standard date means the student was first recorded on the October census for years 1 to 11. For reception pupils, this could be October or the January census. Therefore, where a student is first recorded in January or May census, this would be non-typical, excluding the reception year, whose typical first census could be October or January. Because of the cancellation of the May 2020 census, pupils joining between the January and May 2020 dates attract funding for mobility based on their entry date. So school-led funding, this constitutes sparsity, lump sum, split sites, rates, PFI, and exceptional circumstances related to premises. For sparsity, again, another optional factor. Schools that are eligible for sparsity must meet 2 criteria. They are in areas where pupils would have to travel significant distance to an alternative school should the school close, or they are small schools. Support in funding has been increased in 22 to 23 by the £10,000 mentioned earlier to £55,000 for primary and £80,000 for secondaries, and can be tapered. Only a few local authorities will have schools that are eligible for sparsity funding. 53 local authorities used this factor last year. This factor allocates funding to schools that are remote, measured by sparsity distances, and are small based on the average year group size. This year we have changed the distance measure from a straight line or crowflies basis to a road distance. To calculate a school's sparsity distance, we take all pupils for whom it is the second nearest compatible school and find the average shortest road distance from these pupils' home postcodes to the second nearest school. In addition, this year, there is the option of using a distance taper threshold of 20% below the main thresholds, operating as a sliding scale. Further details of this plus examples are set out in the operational guide and NFF technical notes. These changes have increased the number of small and rural schools that would attract this funding to 1,300 and doubled the funding through this factor from 42 to 95 million. The average year group sizes and distance thresholds remain unchanged other than the changes we just discussed there. Local authorities can opt to apply a taper or as a lump sum. If a taper methodology is used, a school will attract sparsity funding in inverse proportion to its average year group size. Different values and methodologies can be used for primary, middle, all through and secondary phases. Sparsity funding is allocated to schools using the taper methodology as part of the NFF. Lump sum is another optional factor which is used by all local authorities. Local authorities can set a flat lump sum for all phases or differentiate the sums for primary and secondary. The maximum lump sum is £175,000, even for schools that receive a London Fringe uplift. Although this is an optional factor, as said, all local authorities do use this, although how much local authorities distribute in this way is wide-ranging. Last year, local authorities set lump sums between £70,000, £75,400 and £175,000. But it should be noted that the most local authorities set a single lump sum of £117,800 to mirror the NFF. Middle school should be given a weighted average, as detailed in the operational guide. Amalgamated schools will also attract a percentage of both or all lump sums. Where schools amalgamate during the financial year 21-22 or on the 1st of April 2021, they will retain 85% of the predecessor lump sums for the financial year 22-23. Where schools amalgamate after the 1st of April 2022, the new school will receive funding equivalent to the funding formula of both schools added together for the appropriate proportion of the year. This means that they receive the combined lump sum for the remainder of the year in which they amalgamate, and 85% of the joint lump sum the following year. Schools are also able to apply for up to 70% of the following year, but this would require a disapplication request and will be considered on a case-by-case basis. Split site's another optional factor. Approximately 2/3 of local authorities used this factor last year. The purpose of this factor is to support the schools that have unavoidable extra costs because the school buildings are on a separate site. Local authorities set the criteria for paying the split site factor. Criteria for providing extra funding should be clear, transparent, incorporating clear and objective trigger points and a clear formula for allocating additional funding, such as the sites are a minimum distance apart as the crow flies and the sites are separated by a public highway. The provision on the additional site does not qualify for an individual school budget share through the DSG, or that the school has remote playing fields separated from the school by a minimum distance and there is no safe walking route for pupils, or a percentage of staff are required to teach on both sites on a daily basis to support the principle of a whole school policy and to maintain the integrity and delivery of the national curriculum, or a minimum percentage of pupils are taught on each site on a daily basis. Please be mindful of how this criteria is worded. We are often presented with criteria saying separated by a main road. This is shared at school forum meetings, and you need to be mindful if a head teacher of a school that is separated by a road reads it, they could argue that it's a main road. Therefore, do make the criteria as specific as you can. All schools and academies that meet the criteria will be eligible for split site funding. Provide detail of how the funding will be distributed. This can be on a rate per pupil basis, or a lump sum, or a rate per square metre of additional site. Values for primary and secondary schools can be different and payment rates can be stepped, i.e. distance between sites increases. It's worth noting that schools sharing facilities, federated schools and schools with remote sixth forms or remote early years provision are not eligible for split site funding. So the way rates are paid is changing from 22 to 23. Rates will be paid directly by ESFA to billing authorities on behalf of all maintained schools and academies from 22-23 onwards. Local authorities will no longer need to fund rates at their estimate of the actual cost and will no longer allocate rate payments to schools. From April 22 onwards, billing authorities will communicate the cost of schools' rates to the ESFA by uploading rates bill data to an online portal. Local authorities and schools will have observer access to this. Local authorities will be able to continue to claim back money for historic adjustments arising in 21 to 22 through recording changes for the final time in the 22 to 23 APT. Final adjustments will be received by local authorities in the 22, 23, 24 NFF allocations, with payments reflected in their DSG from April 23. Local authorities should continue to record rates data in the 22 to 23 APT, as this information will be used to aid the new processes by providing useful estimates and comparisons for future years. There will be no need to record this data in the APT from 23-24 onwards. Rates should also continue to be reflected on the Section 251 outturn statement, CFR, and in each school's accounts. Further details on how this will be managed technically will be provided in due course. Local authorities will not be required, as said, from 23-24 to submit anything through the APT. There's further details in the response to the consultation which has been published on this. So PFI, again, another optional factor. So the purpose of this factor is to support schools that have unavoidable extra premises costs because they are a PFI school, and to cover situations where the PFI affordability gap is delegated and paid back to the local authority. Methodologies for funding PFI schools must be objective and clear and capable of being replicated for academies. The purpose of the factor is to fund the additional costs to a school of being in a PFI contract, not necessarily the full cost, as some costs may be covered within other factors. If a PFI factor is used, all PFI schools should receive it. There may be different arrangements between contracts, but within a contract, all PFI schools should receive funding on an equivalent basis. This does not necessarily mean all schools should receive the same amount per pupil, but they should be treated on a consistent basis. Clear formula examples for funding PFI schools are allocations in accordance with an original governor's agreement, or allocations reflect the difference between the PFI contractual cost and the grant received by the local authority, less any local authority contribution. Methodologies for allocating could include a percentage of the school's budget share, a per pupil rate, a rate per square metre of floor area, or a historical lump sum previously agreed and indexed by a percentage each year. If you consider there are any circumstances which may have significant impacts on an existing PFI contract, including potential grounds for termination, please do contact the DFE private finance team to discuss in the first instance, as such matters may impact on your funding. Full details and examples of methodologies are again available within the operational guide. So exceptional circumstances relating to premises. This is another optional factor. Local authorities can apply to the ESFA to use exceptional factors relating to school premises costs. ESFA may approve additional factors in cases where the nature of the school premises gives rise to significant additional costs greater than 1% of the total school's budget, and where such costs affect fewer than 5% of the schools, including academies within the local authority. Examples of what this could include could be rents, joint use of leisure facilities, building school for the future schemes, additional contribution to the life cycle maintenance costs, the hire of PE facilities, listed buildings, or schools with a farm included as part of the educational provision. All applications will be considered on their own merits, and you should not assume that if they fall to one of these categories, that they have been previously approved, that they will be again. Where previously approved and criteria is still being met, the factor can continue to be used for up to 6 years before you need to reapply. When considering making a request, you should look at the circumstances of academies and free schools, as well as maintained schools. So geographic funding. So this covers areas such as London Fringe, minimum funding guarantee, growth, and falling roles. London Fringe is an optional factor, however it's only applicable to 5 local authorities. The purpose of this factor is to support schools that have higher costs because they are in the London Fringe area and only part of the local authority is in that area. The multiplier is applied to 7 per pupil led factors, the lump sum factor and the sparsity factor. The factor can be applied in one of 2 ways, not both, either as a multiplier of 1.0156 or as a multiplier of the differential of the area cost adjustment of fringe and non-fringe zones within the local authority. This mirrors the national funding formula calculations, and the differentials are set out in the operational guide for the 5 local authorities, which are Buckinghamshire, Essex, Hertfordshire, Kent, and West Sussex. So the minimum funding guarantee. Local authorities can set a pre-16 MFG in their local formula to protect schools from excessive year-on-year changes and to allow changes in pupil characteristics. For example, reducing the levels of deprivation in a school to flow through. Local authorities can choose to set an MFG between 0.5% and up to plus 2%. Local authorities will need to consult on the level of MFG, as with the rest of the formula. Any local authorities wanting to set an MFG outside of these parameters must apply for exceptional permission through the disapplication process. The MFG applies to pupils in reception to Year 11 only. Early years pupils and post-16 pupils are excluded from this calculation. Certain elements of funding need to be added to the school's budget shares before the MFG calculation. These could be funding deducted through the negative factor for schools entered into the risk protection arrangement under Regulation 19, funding for de-delegated services that have been agreed with the schools forum under Regulation 11.5 and 11.6, and negative adjustments for excluded pupils during the year under Regulation 29. There are several formula factors that are automatically excluded from the MFG calculation, as not doing so would result in excessive protection or would be inconsistent with other policies. Examples of this are the 22 to 23 lump sum. This is excluded from both the baseline and the 22 to 23 funding, so that schools are protected against significant change in the lump sum between years. Any higher lump sum paid under the regulations in 21 to 22 for amalgamated schools, this is excluded from the baseline only. If there's a higher lump sum paid under regulations in 22 to 23 for amalgamating schools, this is excluded from the 22 to 23 funding only. The 22 to 23 sparsity factor, this is excluded from both the baseline and the 22 to 23 funding, so that schools are protected against the significant change in the sparsity value between years. Rates are also excluded from both the baseline and the 22 to 23 funding at their respective values each year. Also, any positive adjustments for excluded pupils during the year under Regulation 29. MFG exemptions. So there are exceptional circumstances where local authorities may want to disapply the MFG if there is significant change in a school's circumstance or pupil numbers. For instance, schools that previously qualified for a split site, PFI or exceptional factor but are no longer eligible, or vice versa. Or where the normal operation of the MFG would produce perverse results for a very small schools with falling or rising roles. Or secondary schools that are admitting primary age pupils who would otherwise be overprotected at the secondary age weighted pupil unit of funding. Or where overprotection would otherwise occur, for example, where additional funding has been distributed in the previous year and the authority can demonstrate that the funding is genuinely a one-off. It's worth highlighting that any disapplication request would need to be specific for that year only, and the department would not expect these to be repeated. Prior approvals will not automatically be carried forward. Details of the calculations along with examples are in the operational guide. There is a large section on the MFG. Capping and scaling. It is likely that protection will still be required in some areas as a result of changes to formulas. Schools NFF will not include a gains cap for 22-23, although gains can be capped through the formula to allow affordability. Capping and scaling must be applied on the same basis to all schools. It no longer has to be applied only to the extent that it offsets the cost of the MFG, since that could prevent local authorities from coming close to the NFF. Local authorities and their schools forum will therefore need, as part of their formula modelling, to determine whether and how to limit any gains. This remains a local decision. Capping and scaling factors must not be applied to schools that have opened in the last 7 years and have not reached their full number of year groups. This definition of new and growing schools does not include existing schools that are extending to include a new phase or have empty year groups in the new phase. Capping and scaling must also not take the school below the MPPLs. Where you do elect to apply a gains cap in 22-23, the cap must be at least as high as the MFG threshold. This ensures that all schools retain any gains up to the MFG threshold, even where a cap is applied. Funds. Local authorities are responsible for funding the following growth needs for all schools in their area. For new and existing maintained schools and academies, the Growth Fund can only be used to support growth in pre-16 pupil numbers to meet basic need, support additional classes needed to meet the infant class size regulation, and meet the costs of new schools. To meet this responsibility, most local authorities set aside funding to cover this growth. The amount of the fund can vary depending on the local authority's predictions on growth. Growth funding is within the local authority schools block DSG allocations, calculated using the same methodology as in 2020 to 21, based on growth in pupil numbers between October 19 and October 20 censuses. Local authorities which received growth funding protection in 21 to 22 will continue to receive this in 22 to 23, meaning a maximum reduction of minus 0.5% of their total DSG school block allocation in 21 to 22. As growth is within the schools block, any movement of funding from the schools formula to its growth fund would not be treated as a transfer between blocks. If doing this, you would need to consult your schools forum on the total growth fund. The growth fund may not be used to support schools in financial difficulty. Any such support for maintained schools should be provided from a de-delegated contingency. Must also not be used to support general growth due to popularity, which is managed through lagged funding. Local authorities are required to produce criteria on which any growth funding is to be allocated, which must be agreed by the schools forum. Criteria must include details that the growth fund. Local authorities are required to produce criteria on which any growth funding is to be allocated, which must be agreed by the schools forum. Criteria must include details that the growth fund is available to both schools and academies, details that growth fund is available to meet basic need growth as opposed to popular growth, details of the methodology of distributing funding. Criteria for allocating growth should contain clear objective trigger points for qualification and a clear formula for calculating allocations, with these criteria being applied to schools on a consistent basis. Details of compliant growth fund criteria can be found in the operational guide, along with suitable methodologies for distributing funding, such as per pupil or via a lump sum. The department has also published further guidance for local authorities setting up growth funds, including examples of approved growth fund criteria from 2020 to 21 onwards. Any underspends in growth funding should be reported to the schools forum and can be carried forward to the following funding period. Any overspend will form part of the overall DSG surplus or deficit balance. Fall in roles funding. As with the growth fund, the fall in roles fund criteria is set by the local authority. There is specific guidance for this. Local authorities may set aside school block funding to create a small fund to support good and outstanding schools with falling roles, where local planning data shows that the surplus places will be needed within the next 3 financial years. The schools forum should agree both the value of the fund and the criteria for allocation. Compliant criteria would generally contain some of the following features: available for good and outstanding schools only, surplus capacity exceeds a minimum number of pupils or a percentage of the PAN published admission number. A minimum percentage of surplus places will be required within the next 3 years. Formula funding available to schools will not support provision of appropriate curriculum for existing cohort, or schools will need to make redundancies in order to contain spending within its formula budget. Methodologies for allocation could be a rate per vacant place up to a maximum specified, or a lump sum with clear parameters for calculation. As with growth, any surplus should be reported to the schools forum at the year end and can be carried forward to the following funding period. A total of 23 local authorities retained the fall in roles fund in 21 to 22. Okay, well, thank you everybody for attending the workshop. So this has been recorded. Thanks to all of my colleagues who've fielded those questions for me whilst I was going through the presentation.